Hello, welcome to the channel, The Journey to the Moon Explained. It could be said that NASA was founded by force. The launch of Sputnik, the first artificial satellite in history, by the Soviet Union in 1957, was enough reason to give the space race more momentum. But it was not until Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space that the most ambitious decision was made: to reach the moon. When President John F. Kennedy announced that the journey to the moon was going to be possible, it was a surprise to everyone. Even to those who were going to work on the project, as their combined spaceflight experience amounted to only 20 minutes. They had never really been in orbit and were challenged to go to the moon. No one knew exactly how all of this was going to be achieved, but with the surrounding pressure and the encouragement and confidence of John F. Kennedy, they got to work. NASA then started calling the best test pilots to their homes, proposing the project to them and also warning them not to talk to anyone about it. One by one, they all arrived at a hotel in Houston and registered under the same name, Max Peck. After several months of knowledge exams and the most demanding and unusual physical and unpredictable reaction tests, only 14 pilots were selected for the space program. Once there, the tests continued, but this time they were about survival in the desert, the jungle, the sea, and any kind of potentially fatal situations. And let's not forget the theoretical aspects. While many already had knowledge of a particular engineering field, they all had to learn something completely unknown to them, such as orbital mechanics and geology. In 1965, NASA implemented the Gemini space program, which consisted of capsules maneuvered by two men and would orbit the Earth to perfect the tasks that might be required for the journey to the moon. The task for the astronauts who began to take spacewalks was not easy. They had to confront the initial problems of moving in space, based on assumptions made from Earth, the discomforts of the suits, the difficulties posed by body movement in space, the maneuverability of the cabins, of objects in general. All those inconveniences had to be noted down to be improved in subsequent flights. After the Gemini space program, Apollo came. This time, the maneuvered capsule would carry 3 men. Despite all these precautions and measures taken, accidents happen. On January 27, 1967, during a training exercise for Apollo 1, 3 astronauts died as a result of a fire that broke out in the cabin. Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee, trapped in this small space, perished in the blaze, while other workers present were powerless to save them. Following Apollo 1, Apollo 4, 5, and 6 were unmanned test flights. The absence of Apollo 2 and 3 is a bureaucratic naming issue, but the missions did exist, including an Apollo 1A. The manned flights began with Apollo 7 and continued up to Apollo 10, which were reconnaissance missions of Earth and lunar orbits. Yes, the first mission to reach the moon was not Apollo 11, but rather Apollo 8. This photograph was taken by that mission while it orbited our natural satellite. The giant leap for mankind, as Neil Armstrong said, would come with Apollo 11. Let's focus on this flight, which was the most important one. Apollo 11 was launched on July 16, 1969. It required a 3-stage rocket, in this case, the Saturn V, to propel the spacecraft at a speed that would allow the rocket to escape Earth's gravitational pull. The first stage lifted the rocket to an altitude of 68 kilometers at a speed of 9,920 kilometers per hour. The second stage pushed the spacecraft to an altitude of 176 kilometers at 25,182 kilometers per hour. The third stage orbited the Earth 1.5 times before performing the translunar injection, which propelled the spacecraft on its course to the moon. 40 minutes later, the Command Module Columbia, that's the name of that conical module, docked with the Lunar Module Eagle, requiring a 180 degrees turn. Once the modules were docked, they headed towards the moon. Passing through the Van Allen belts was not a major difficulty. The Van Allen belts are layers of charged energy particles that are trapped around a magnetized planet like ours. On Earth, it is the region where the magnetic field has trapped particles from the solar wind. They contain high levels of radiation that are deadly without proper protection. The propulsion maneuver used to direct a spacecraft to the moon. It was designed to avoid the areas of higher radiation in the Van Allen belt, so the belt was crossed in just under an hour, which was insufficient time for the radiation levels to be lethal. Additionally, the metal of the helmet played a crucial role in protecting the astronauts as well. The amount of radiation to which the astronauts were exposed averaged 1 rem, which is equivalent to the radiation you would receive living at sea level for 3 years. Apollo 11 reached lunar orbit on July 19. The following day, only Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong entered the lunar module, while Michael Collins stayed in the Columbia module. From there, Collins was able to take this particular photo, making him the only living or deceased human who was not captured by the camera. The intensity of the sunlight reflected on the moon and Earth makes it impossible to capture other stars and contributes to a sense of vast solitude. When the lunar module landed in an area called the Sea of Tranquility, a camera located on its exterior captured Neil Armstrong's live descent. Once on the surface, their first action was to analyze the terrain and its navigational capability. Armstrong then placed a commemorative plaque and proceeded to set up television cameras before planting the American flag, which appeared to ripple due to the inertia. After completing these tasks, Armstrong spoke with President Nixon and then focused on collecting rock and lunar dust samples. He also took some iconic photographs, including the well-known one of Buzz Aldrin. Aldrin, on the other hand, had to perform a few small experiments reported by Houston, such as observing the effects of gravity when kicking up lunar dust and studying the thermal effects of the sun and shadows on the spacesuits. He analyzed whether there were temperature differences when in the shade or not and examined the surface in relation to shadows and colors. Out of the nearly 22 hours that Eagle was on the surface, Armstrong and Aldrin only spent 2.5 hours outside. Before returning to the module, they unpacked a seismometer and a laser reflector, which they installed on the surface. They then re-entered the module and began their journey back to the Columbia. Once the two modules were docked, the astronauts reunited and left the Eagle to embark on the return home. 6 more missions followed Apollo 11. During all of them, excluding Apollo 13, a total of 12 men have walked on the moon. In addition to Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, the following astronauts were also there: Pete Conrad, Alan Bean, Alan Shepard, Edgar Mitchell, David Scott, James Irwin, John Young, Charles Duke, Harrison Schmitt, and Eugene Cernan. Each of the last 3 missions spent 3 days on the lunar surface, taking photos, installing experimental equipment, collecting samples, and maneuvering the lunar rover to new locations. The final mission, Apollo 17, left the camera on the lunar surface to capture that last moment when the lunar module left the moon for the last time on December 14, 1972. The Cold War no longer posed a significant threat. The space race had been decisively won, and the US government saw the space program as an unnecessary financial burden. The budget was reduced, and the dream of returning to the moon remained stagnant until today. In 2012, the Lunar Spacecraft Reconnaissance Orbiter pointed its cameras at the landing sites and captured the remnants of the exploration. In those images, it is possible to detect the shadows of some of the flags left during the lunar missions. They seem to be there, waiting. The myths have been debunked several times. You can find the answers to all your questions on the web. However, there are still people who doubt all of this and cannot be convinced, of course. Neil deGrasse Tyson demonstrated this in an interview with a journalist who believed it had all been staged. In response to each question from the interviewer, Neil calmly provided the appropriate scientific answer. At the end of the interviewer said something that was already expected: "I still think there's material to fake it. This is a hoax." This, on the other hand, is the product of ingenuity and hard human work when determined to achieve something. Let us honor that work. Let us honor the sacrifices. And let us honor the lives that were lost. That concludes the video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to see more content.